Mr. Black, I know that for your many contributions that you made to the industry that you received a very nice letter from the Lumbermen's Association. I know you're a little reluctant to read it, but I'd like to ask you to read it if you don't mind from the president of the Oklahoma Lumbermen's Association that you received in March '66. Would you mind reading it?
I guess after you get to a certain age, your modesty kind of leaves you a little bit. Well, this is a letter written by the president of the Oklahoma Lumbermen's Association. You know, in our line of business, the General Sash and Door only sold retail lumber dealers. And from the start, when we were United Sash and Door Company at the beginning back in 21 until 42, we kept up with the same policy that we've always had, except during the wartime we did, as I've mentioned before, go into some work with the government on their operations during the war. However, this letter was written right after we sold out to the Huddig Sash and Door Company, March 29, 1966. This is from the Oklahoma Lumbermen's Association. Bill Morgan is manager, addressed to me at 1631 South Elwood. Dear Art, in recent publications, we notice that you are now retiring. Art, as you know, you're a lifetime member of the OLA, that's Oklahoma Lumbermen's Association, and we in OLA feel you have contributed much, not only to our industry, but to the entire culture of the state of Oklahoma. With the above in mind, we all of Oklahoma Lumbermen's Association would like to honor you at our annual all-family gathering at Arrowhead Lodge, Eufaula, July 16th. We'll greatly appreciate your circling this date and advising, if it will be possible, to be with us to receive the thanks of all of us. Sincerely, Oklahoma Lumbermen's Association, W.K. Bill Hicks, President.
That's very, very nice, and I certainly appreciate your adding these remarks to the wonderful interview we had with you the other day. Thank you very much, Mr. Black. Go ahead and add this about the tree, Mr. Black.
We, even here in New Oklahoma, have some traditions, and one of the finest that I know has been brought to us by our Indian people who built up a civilization in here before we came. And Angie Bull, in a short article, mentions one of the things we have in mind. On a hill overlooking the Arkansas River in an area now bordered by 17th and 18th Streets and Cheyenne and Denver Avenues in Tulsa, and under a great oak which still stands, the local polkas, or the creeks, Indians laid out their chunky yard or council square. Next, they cleared space for their ballpark and sought to impress their new neighbors, the Osages, with their peaceful intentions. And these things are the beginnings of a modern American city. We felt that it would be entirely in line, inasmuch as we were building a new city hall, to have a picture hung of that tree. And we called a meeting, the organization called a meeting of the DALRs, Daughters of the American Revolution, who had put a plaque on that tree denoting the fact that that is where the first people settled, Indian people of the Creek Nation. And we asked if it would be possible for us that if we would get a picture of it made and donated to the city, whether they'd receive it. And accordingly, I wrote the following letter to the mayor and the board of commissioners of the city of Tulsa. This letter is to thank you for your interest in helping protect and preserve the memory of Tulsa's earliest historical landmark, the Creek Tribal Council Oak at 16th and Cheyenne Avenues. This has been done by having a painting of the tree by Clarence Allen hung in the City Hall. We wish to also thank the Arts Council of Tulsa for their advice and help in producing the painting. We are then carrying on a program with the Tulsa chapter, the Daughters of the American Revolution, started in 1923 when they placed a brass plaque upon the tree in the yard of Harry Sinclair, which was later Charles S. Peters' home. We know that in the years to come, your administration will be remembered for the many forward moves you have made for your good government. Among them will be the memorializing and taking of the replica of the tribal oak, the symbol on the first beginnings. The following individuals and business concerns contributed to this: Alfred Aronson, Dr. and Mrs. Cecil Cotton, Mr. D.A.R. Tulsa Chapter, D.A.R. Business Professional Chapter, Downtown Tulsa Unlimited, First National Bank, Fourth National Bank, Home Builders of Greater Tulsa, George Knapp Advertising Company, W.E. Doe Mack Chief of the Creeks, National Bank of Tulsa, Tulsa Retail Lumbermen's Association, Tulsa Tribune, Tulsa World, Utica Square National Bank, Mrs. Louise M. Witham, Clarence C. Allen, Arthur J. Black. No one turned me down. And Clarence Allen told me to quit collecting money. I collected $700. He said that he didn't want them to feel that he wanted to make a lot of money on them. He normally got about $1,400. But we certainly want to thank him and the city for letting us hang that picture in the City Hall.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Black. This is Penn Woods on March 1st, 1971, and I'm visiting on tape with, is it Miss or Mrs.? Mrs. Elsie? Mrs. N.J. Gubser, or Elsie H. Gubser. She is a pioneer of Tulsa, has been here since 1909, and she has been a teacher for many, many years. We're in her home, and I've looked over some of the beautiful artwork that she does. She painted a beautiful watercolor today, and said that watercolors are not her specialty, but she thought she'd just try it out today and try it out with a very beautiful piece of work. Mrs. Gubser, I wonder to begin with if you would tell me about your family background, who your parents were, your mother's maiden name, where they were born, and when you came to Oklahoma.
My mother was born in Springfield, Missouri on May the 3rd, 1870. And we always teased her and said that she wasn't really born, that the Frisco train brought her, because that was the day the Frisco train came all the way from St. Louis and ended in Springfield. Mm-hmm. She was born in Springfield, Missouri, and her name was Nellie Moody, M-O-O-D-Y.
Your father?
My father was Ernest Heaton, H-E-A-T-O-N, and he was born in Knightstown, Indiana.
When did you come to Oklahoma?
Oh, I didn't come to Oklahoma until 1909.
1909. Where did you go to school?
I went to school in Warrensburg State Teacher College. I graduated from high school in Sedalia, Missouri, because that's where I was born.
Did you come with your family in 1909 or by yourself?
Oh, I came by myself. I was a school teacher. Good heavens, you don't think
How'd you happen to come to Oklahoma?
Oh, hell, the reason I came to Oklahoma, it wasn't Indian Territory.
No, it just finished being.
Yeah. I had a job to teach in Joplin, Missouri, and I was down on the creek bank in Arkansas with my father and grandfather and with a cousin. And the cousin lived in this place in Arkansas, and he came out on the creek bank and brought us a telegram that had been sent to me to Joplin. My mother had picked it up and had forwarded it on to me in Arkansas, and it said, would you accept a position in the Tulsa City Schools for $75 a month? Since I was only going to get $40 a month in Joplin, I decided I would take the 75, and I said yes. My father said, you can't go to Tulsa. That's the most wicked city in the world. And I begged and pled, and so I sent back a telegram that I would accept it. And my father said, all right, you can, providing we get a place for you to live. So when we got back to Joplin, he saw Frank Neff, who was our minister, and that Frank Neff was also a minister here in Tulsa later. Well, he asked Frank Neff to find me a place to live. So Frank Neff found me a place to live at a Mrs. Seaton's, old lady Seaton. You remember the big house that had the big white pillars in front? Yes. All right, that's where I lived. The first week, I only stayed there a week. Because I didn't have a decent room. I had a little tiny-weensy room and paid $5 a week for it. I didn't think that. I thought that was too much money. So I got another place. And that's the way I came.
Where did you teach? What school?
Well, there were only 2 teachers of us in the school. We taught in the basement of Henry Kendall College. Mossy Snyder was the teacher of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, and I was the teacher of the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade.
Could you tell about some of your students during those early days who may have later become prominent in Tulsa community or in the state?
There was one of them was Herbert Nicholson, who has just recently died just this last year, and he was in the 6th grade, and there was a boy by the name of Davis. I can't think of his first name right now, but anyway, I hadn't seen him or heard tell of him since I taught school, and I was demonstrating spinning out at the state fair one day, not a few years ago, and a man stood there and watched me a long time, and directly he came over to me and said, hello, Miss Heaton. And I said, who in the world are you? And he said, oh, I'm Julian Davis. Well, Julian Davis, I don't know anything about him except that was the one time. Those are the only 2 students that I know of that was, well, there was one, too. There was a Haley girl. I've forgotten her first name, but she became quite an organist, and she played organ here in Tulsa for many years.
Can you think of any experiences in the early day school teaching here that might be worth mentioning?
One of the chief things I can tell is I lived in town, and I taught out at Henry Kendall College, and there was no transportation. I had no way to go. We didn't have cars in those days. I had a car. My father had a car, but he lived in Joplin. So I went in a streetcar. The streetcar went down 3rd Street as far as Lewis, and it stopped at Lewis, and I had to walk the rest of the way. So I walked in all this perfectly nice dust that we had, no sidewalks. I cut across the fields in order to get there in a hurry, and of course, you know, the dust would gather in my stockings, and by the evening I got home, I was just terrible, and I would go to take a bath, and I would turn the water on, and then the great hunks of mud would come out of the faucet. That was the days when we got our water from the Arkansas River, and then I would have to pay 25 cents for a bottle of 5 gallons of water to put in the bathtub to take a bath in. But as for the school business, there wasn't very much unusual about the school, excepting that I always claimed that I was the principal. We didn't have women principals, but I always claimed I was the principal because I had the older pupils, and if there were any reports had to be made, I had to make them.
How long did you teach in this school?
Well, I came here for that week in September. I met N.J. Gubster at Grandma Parker's boarding house, which is at the corner of 4th and Cincinnati. I think, yeah, 4th and Cincinnati. Was where that's the bus station, where the bus station is. Well, Grandma Parker's boarding house was there, and all the eligible bachelors in town boarded there. And, of course, all of us school teachers went there to board, too. So I met N.J. Gubster the very first Sunday that I came to Tulsa. And that was in September. And we were engaged in February, and I went home the first day of March, resigned from the school system, went home the 1st day of March. We were married the 6th day of April. And I have never taught since.
You have not taught in
No,
public school?
not in public school. Mm-mm.
Is he living?
No, he's been dead since 1936.
What was his business?
He was the first county judge of Tulsa County, and then he was a lawyer.
I wonder if during this period, now, if you were married about 1910 or 11, is that correct? 1910. Could you describe Tulsa, as you recall, prior to World War I, how it was?
Well, it was the one thing about Tulsa that was unusual was the first thing that I noticed when I went to church, I didn't see any white-haired people. Everybody had dark hair or blondes, either one. There was no white-haired people. It was a town of young men. That was one thing. The next thing that I couldn't help but notice immediately after I was married was the fact that everybody was busy wanting Tulsa to grow, wanting Tulsa to win. There wasn't anybody that asked the businessmen to do anything that they didn't hop right in and do it. It was a marvelous sort of feeling that I had, because I had come from old communities where everything was settled and people were old and settled down. Then, of course, at that time, things were building just like they are now. You just got lost when you started out. You never knew that you were going to get there exactly, because today the streets had been changed. And it just was a building, glorious time, all the time.
How were the streets when you came?
Well, I lived up on North Denver, and by the way, I lived in my house 60 years. The house that we started when we were married, and I moved into it, and I just moved out of it this September. Denver was paved, but the Haskell, just north of me, was not paved. A lot of the long north and south streets were paved, but many of the other streets were unpaved. I remember the old cemetery over, I don't remember what they called it, but it was over on the west side, along around, seems to me like 3rd or 4th Street, and around Guthrie or something like that. It was a peculiar old... Huh?
That's gone.
I know it's gone now, but it was a cemetery there, and there was nothing paved much around it. I remember that. We used to walk over there a lot.
Do you recall when they were you here when they filled in the street to the level of these buildings downtown to pave Main Street, or was Main Street paved?
Main Street was paved. Main Street was paved when I came. At least up till the tracks. I don't remember whether it was paved on the other side of the tracks much or not. I don't remember much about that. But I think it was paved beyond the tracks.
What about the activity from the standpoint of old social and civic during the period prior to World War I?
I'll tell you one of the things that I think is wonderful that I kind of miss now. We don't have the famous people coming here like we used to have. For example, long years ago, the New York Symphony Orchestra played here. We had Nazimova was here. We had Alma Gluck, Schumann Hayek. She was here about 3 times, I think. And just everybody that was famous came to Tulsa.
Mary Garden.
Yes, Mary Garden was here. I saw her twice or 3 times. It was marvelous.
Why did Tulsa attract so many of them then?
Because the people were, well, for instance, my husband went in debt about $300 and some nearly every time we had the opera, because the businessmen got down in their pockets and said, all right, we'll bring the opera, and if you don't make it up, we'll pay it. So he was always on the paying end because they never made it all up. And people were willing to give. They didn't go out and have the big drives that they have now, but if they didn't sell enough tickets to pay the artists, why the businessmen got down in their pockets and paid it. We always laughed and said, well, these 3 tickets, or these 4 tickets that we have sure cost us plenty.
They made the first Goodwill tour, I understand, right shortly after statehood, which would have been 1908 or 9.
No,
Was that?
No, no. The first one they made, I think, was 1901 or 1902 or something like that. Because my husband went on two. They had two of them. And there's another thing. He was a young lawyer just starting out, but he borrowed $100 to make the trip.
Which trip? Which year was it?
That was the first year.
The first
I
year.
wasn't here. I heard him tell about it.
1902.
I think it was 1901 or 2.
1901 or 2.
He just had come. He came in 1901.
Did he? What did he say about the Goodwill tour?
Oh, he thought it was wonderful. And he told the story that when they got to Chicago, well, he told about how they marched down the streets, and they took Will Rogers with them, and he twirled a rope as they walked, as they marched, and he was down at, they got to the Board of Trade in Chicago, and I don't know how the Board of Trade is now, but I know how it was then because I'd been there. You walked in off the street, and there was in a lobby, and then the Board of Trade was really a pit, and you had to go down steps to it. And old Will Rogers walked up to the right to the edge of that pit and twirled his rope and grabbed a bunch of the men with a rope and pulled it together down in the pit, and the whole place stopped. And here came a telegram from New York, because even the tickers stopped. And here came a telegram from New York saying, "What in the world is the matter?" And they wrote back, they telegraphed back. I saw a copy of the telegram once, which said, "Tulsa's here." That was from Chicago to New York. Tulsa's here. So that was one of the things in the Goodwill tour that I thought was very interesting.
Where was Will Rogers located then? Where was he working out of it that year?
Oh, he was in New York by that time. He must have been. I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure.
I don't either. I don't know when he.
I don't know.
Got into the.
I guess he didn't. No, this is before he ever went to Chicago. Oh, this is before he ever went to New York. This was when he was just first starting.
So he was in show business in Oklahoma.
He was popular with wherever he went.
Yes, he was popular with people.
Do you know any other experiences or stories regarding Will Rogers from its own experience? That's a tremendous experience.
I think that's swell.
That one experience is worth the day. That one experience on tape. Can you recall any stories of any of the other Goodwill trips?
No, the second one, my husband didn't seem to think very much of the second one. Well, the first one, I don't know whether you know about. They published a newspaper.
No.
Well, they had a printing press on it. Did you know about that? Well, they had a printing press they carried along, and they published a daily newspaper, of course, boosting Tulsa. And when they stopped at every city, they deliver a whole mass of these newspapers as they went along, and they had more fun with those newspapers.
Can you think of prior to World War I, kind of putting it in time element? Can you think of any of the? Were you involved in any of the clubs or any of the social events? Could you tell about those prior to World War I?
Well, I don't know. Remember exactly. I don't know exactly what you mean, excepting that just at the beginning of the World War I. Well, before that. My husband was very much interested in birds, and so he helped to organize the first Audubon Society here in Tulsa. And, of course, I had to come along. I couldn't stand it. I wanted the children in on it, so I had a children's organization. And it was a national organization then, but now they don't have the children. So we had a children's national organization of Audubon Society. Then World War was about to come on, and the Red Cross was organized, and Judge helped in the big Red Cross, and I started a junior Red Cross up. We met in the old Sequoia School up on the north side, and those kids learned to do all sorts of things. We rolled bandages and had lots of fun, and that was but they didn't last too long, just a year or two, and then they lost interest in it.
What was some of the other local activity during World War I?
don't remember.
Was your husband in World War One?
No. No, he was too old.
He served as county judge. Is that
Yes,
the first county
first
judge?
county judge of Tulsa County. As he laughed and said, there wouldn't be any of these little towns around here if it hadn't been for him, because he swore in all the officers. He had to go up to, he went up to, when he was elected, he had to go up to Guthrie to be sworn in. Guthrie was the capital, and he went to Guthrie to be sworn in.
Do you recall from his experiences, his judicial experiences, anything he might have relayed, or anything that happened in his period as a judge that might be of a human interest?
I don't remember anything like that very much, because he didn't talk business very much to me. There's only one thing I do remember, and I've thought about it so many times right recently. One Saturday morning, we had a horse and buggy, and one Saturday morning, this was before my first child was born, and one Saturday morning he said, Elsie, real early, he said, Elsie, fix lunch and let's take a trip with a horse and buggy. And I said, all right, and we started out. We went up in the Osage, and I kept saying, what do you want to do? He didn't fish. He didn't like to do any fishing or anything, and he said, I just want to go up in the Osage. Well, we went up in the Osage, and we wandered around and looked at birds and looked at trees and flowers and things like that, and I was bored to death, and he was just up there, and I couldn't figure out. And we ate, and he didn't want to come home, and I kept talking about coming home, and he didn't want to come home. We waited till dark, and then we came home after dark. And after we got clear in the house, I said, well, what in the world was the matter with you today? And he said, I didn't want to scare you or anything, but said, I was threatened. He had a bootlegger case, and he said, I was threatened, and I thought I'd better just take you out of town. And I've thought about that recently, since we've been having this trouble in Tulsa.
Is that the only time anything of that sort?
That's the only time that anything like that ever
Do you
happened.
recall any famous cases that he had, or well-known cases that he had?
No, I don't, because I didn't, as I said, I didn't think. Oh, I remember the race ride.
Could you tell about that?
Woo, yes. We had a habit of sitting on the terrace on our porch, and in the evening, and we were sitting there that evening. It was a very nice, warm evening, and we were sitting with the children, and my uncle was here, and we were sitting. We were all just sitting there talking, and suddenly, my husband loved to quote poetry. I couldn't quote poetry much, but he did. Well, all of a sudden I looked up in the sky and I said, silently one by one through the infinite meadows of heaven blossom the lovely stars, the forget-me-nots of the angels. And just then we heard the telephone ring. And my husband went in to answer the phone. And the minute he answered the phone, he came rushing out and he said, bring the children in right quick and shut all the windows and doors. And I said, well, what's the matter? He said, don't ask me now, but do what I tell you. And so we rushed in, we shut the windows and the doors, and we rushed upstairs. He had us go upstairs, and he said, now take the mattresses off the bed and put them on the floor. And I said, what in the world? He says, I just was warned that people were going up and down the streets shooting in the windows. Well, I was just scared nearly to death, and I had a colored man and woman up in my garage upstairs, and she was ironing that night up in her house, and I could see her, so I looked out. I said, what's the trouble? And he said, well, the Negroes are causing trouble. Well, with that, I looked out, and I could see her ironing, and I could see her husband there, and they had a baby, and I could see everything. They weren't bothering anybody. Well, nothing happened. And we I just stayed up practically all night watching that. And they went to bed at 11 o'clock. I saw them turn out the lights, and nobody came down the stairs. Well, the next morning, we got up very, very early, and telephone rang very early, and somebody told Judge Heard them say that they were going to collect all the Negroes and put them down in the convention hall, and also at the county fairgrounds. Well, I said, they're not going to take my Bessie and her baby. That's a cinch. So we went out and got them, brought them in the house. And we had a basement. And I said, now you go down the basement because I don't want anybody to see you. So they went down the basement, and I cooked their breakfast and took it down to them. And then by noon, Judge and I got in the car, and the way we went out to try to find the old man that was our janitor at the church, and two or three other. I had another woman that ironed for me that I was very fond of, and I went and tried to find her. And we worked all day long, couldn't find anybody. We found plenty, but not them. And of course, we heard all the gossip and all that sort of stuff, and worried ourselves nearly to death. And the next morning, as we went down, we found out the trash that had caused all the trouble were a lot of old trampy-looking people lying on the right-of-ways underneath the viaduct there on Denver, sound asleep. They'd been up all night, and there they were, sound asleep. Mad. I was so mad I just nearly died. That was the greatest tragedy that ever happened to Tulsa.
What seemed to bring it on?
Well, there was a wild story about it that, the Ku Klux Klan really did it. It was the outcome of some, because just before that, there was an awful lot of Ku Klux Klan activity here in Tulsa, and evidently that was what really brought it on.
Reactionary,
yes. It didn't have any. They had all kinds of gossip about what happened. They said that some Negro boy was running an elevator, and the girl got in the elevator, and he insulted her or said something to her, and that started it. But whether that did or not, that was the one gossip we heard.
They shot somebody on the courthouse steps.
Well,
somebody got shot the next day, and
I
that
didn't
really did it.
Well, that night is where they burned. That night we could see them burning the Negroes' part of town. We saw them burning it. It was just terrible.
Can you think of, now this was about 1920.
1920, I think.
Can you think of any other major event in Tulsa during this period between 1910 and 20?
One thing I remember, I don't remember for sure what the date was, but I know it was very early. We had, because it was when my little boy was a baby in arms, and my little boy was born in 1912, and he was still a baby in arms. And they had a fair. They called it a Durbar, what did they call that? I can't remember what they called it. Durbar, I think is what they called it. And it was kind of like a fair, and they built up some seats, and you went out there and sat on those seats, and they had all kinds of roping and all that sort of stuff. And I got my first view of an airplane. They had a man that come to fly an airplane, and he did all kinds of stunts. He turned the airplane over, and he did it over top of right over where we were sitting. And I was so mad I nearly died, because I was sure he was going to fall down and and kill me and my baby. So I wouldn't stay. That was the first time we ever had a kind of a county fair here, wasn't it? I think we hadn't had a real kind of something like a county fair.
Do you remember any other airplane instance?
No, I don't. I don't remember much about that, because I didn't go to very many things of that sort. But
what civic or social activities were you involved in between World War I and II?
Oh heavens, I don't know. I know more about the earlier ones than that. Well, of course, I don't know exactly what all I've done, but that sort of thing. But I've been into. Well, I was been active in women's club work, and of course I was active in church work.
Which women's club were you active in?
Well, I was active in the Tulsa Women's Club for a while.
Can you tell about that?
No, not very much. Only that we were going to have us a clubhouse one time. We just nearly worked ourselves off to get a clubhouse, but we never did really until, I guess they've got one now, but we never did know. I'd gotten out of it by the time we finally did. And I did get an organization started at that time in the Women's Club, which was kind of like a handwork I've always been interested in working with your hands. I'm a great believer in women working with their hands.
Like
Yeah, like it's very calming on one's nerves, and I think it's very good.
You've been involved in painting, obviously.
Oh, well,
when
that's
did
a
you start
hobby.
that?
That's a hobby. I started painting, about now what, 1926, I think. It's the first time I ever really tried to paint. That was, I went to Chautauqua, New York, and Mr. Carl von der Laken, who used to be here, Mr. von der Laken, was the teacher at Chautauqua, and I took painting under him. And then but before that, I had drawn always. Even when I was just a little girl, 8 years old, I was always drawing pictures out of. I thought that George Washington's picture was the most wonderful thing on earth, so I copied it all the time out of my. And then when I got to be a young lady, why, the Gibson girl was all the go. So I just learned to do the Gibson girl till you couldn't tell mine from the original Gibson girl.
Who were some of the leaders in Tulsa who were contemporaries of your husband that you can think of?
Oh, heavens, I can't even remember now. Of course, the McBurneys in the McBurney Bank.
Can you tell us about him?
Well, there was Jim McBurney, and there was Sam McBurney, and of course there was Lee McBurney. Lee's still alive.
Have you any recollections regarding the McBurneys?
No, not particularly, but I'll tell you some recollections that I remember very much about. Some of the first, and this is something my daughter has asked me to write up. I will someday if I ever get to it. Grandma Mowbray was one of the old timers here. Her husband was sent here from England as a missionary to the Indians, and then he had died by the time I got here. He'd been dead a long time, and she had a daughter that married an archer, and he was killed by an Indian, put a shot into a barrel of gunpowder down in the early day when Tulsa was just about 3 stores. Well, Grandma Mowbray was a very wonderful old lady, and she used to tell the wildest tales about how she and her husband used to travel through the country to as a missionary, to go see have church. And she told one story about how they stopped. They was going to spend all night at an Indian's house, and they stopped. And as they went in, there were 3 skunks tied to a post out in the yard. And they thought, well, they didn't know what in the world they were for, but they didn't say anything. So that night they had supper, and the man passed the meat around, and the old lady took a piece of the meat, and she started to chew it, and she just chewed and chewed and chewed, and she couldn't get it chewed. And her husband chewed it, and I guess he swallowed his pretty much whole, and she finally got hers out of her mouth. But then the next morning when they got up, why, lo and behold, the old man had gone out and killed the skunks and dressed them, and they were going to fry those skunks to take to the church dinner that day. So the night before, they had skunk meat for supper. She was very much upset by the fact that she had tried to eat skunk, but she couldn't. And she told how that, why in the world she didn't die, she didn't know, because in order to get some water to drink as they went through the country, why, there would be no water hardly at all, and there'd be some of these little dead streams with algae growing on top, and she said, we'd just get down there and scrape off the algae and reach down in with our tin cup and get some water underneath the algae and drink it. But they did. They pulled through, and she lived to be a very old lady. And her granddaughter is still living here in Tulsa, and her great-granddaughter, several of them all living here in Tulsa yet.
What church do you belong to?
Centenary Methodist.
Have you belonged to this particular parish all the time?
Oh, yes. until I did change. When I was married, I was a member of the First Methodist Church when I was married.
What was it like at that time, the First Methodist?
Oh, it was a beautiful building. It was quite large. It was over on, 5th and Boulder. Yeah, I think it was 5th and Boulder.
Is the building still there?
Oh, no. Hasn't been there for years. That's right, 5th and Boulder. And then my husband was a member of Boston Avenue, and he was chairman of the board, and I just taught the primary class in my church. So on the Sunday after we were married, and we started out when we were living in a couple of rooms. They didn't have apartments in those days, and we were living in a couple of rooms waiting for our house to be built. So as we passed by the corner where we could have turned to my church, he started to turn, and I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I thought we'd go over to your church." And I said, "Oh, no, let's go to yours. You've got a bigger job than I have." So we went to Boston Avenue, and I joined Boston Avenue. Well, we stayed at Boston Avenue until about 4 or 5 years later. The bishop persuaded me and my husband and 14 others in the crowd. There were 14 altogether that he persuaded to leave Boston Avenue and go up to the old Tigert Memorial Church, which was up on Main Street. I've forgotten about where, but it was past Brady. It was up on, and it was a church that was a missionary church, mission church. And they wanted to get rid of the mission part of it and make it a self-supporting church, so they persuaded 14 of us from Boston Avenue to move up there. We lived up on the north side, so we all moved up there. And we stayed there until we felt like we needed a bigger building and in a better community. So we built Centenary Methodist Church up on Denver, Golden and Denver.
Is that building still there?
Oh, yes. That building is still
operating.
Oh, yes.
But now you are in...
Now I went back to Centenary. I'm Centenary, yes. But right after my husband died, I just felt like I didn't want to stay at Centenary, so I went back to the First Methodist. And I stayed there about 3 years ago, and then I came back to Centenary.
How many children do you have? 2. 2 children.
Boy and a girl.
And where are they now?
My son lives here in Tulsa, and my daughter lives in Hinsdale, Illinois.
Mm-hmm. In thinking of the period, but say that we talked between 1910 and 1920, and if we think of something else, we'll swing back there. There's no problem. The period after World War I, what was it like in Tulsa then, and what was the feeling and attitude of Tulsa and its...
Well, we were still working. Everybody was just still building. That has been the wonderful thing to me about Tulsa, is this get up and go that everybody has had. That's the thing that I still think is important now. I don't remember very much about things. Oh, yes, you had said something about going back. I was on the board of the YWCA in the early day, even before we had a YWCA building. We had one little tiny wee building, a little wooden building down on, I think it was 4th, down between Main and Boulder on 4th, something like that. Just a little bit of or on 5th, I don't remember which, just a little bit of a building there. And I never will forget, it was during the war, and we had, when the Red Cross had started, and we gave Red Cross training. And Dr. Fred Clinton was the man that gave us instructions on how to how to bandage a person and go through all kinds of Red Cross things. I never will forget that. He was quite a famous doctor here, you know.
Who were during the period following World War I, during and following, who were who were the close friends of your family among people in you and your husband in Tulsa? Can you think?
I've known some.
I'm trying to think of some people that you might, particularly people who played a role in Tulsa history, that you might be able to tell something about, people who may not be here now.
Well, I don't remember really and truly anybody. Huh?
Did you know either the Abernathys
Oh,
or that?
yes.
Active?
You mean the Minister Abernathy? Yes, oh yes. all
John
of them.
Abernathy?
Yeah. Well, I don't know his first name, but the Abernathys, of course, and
That's the one who
Dr.
retired in Oklahoma City?
Yes,
Mhm.
yes, and Dr. John Rice, Mrs. Rice, and oh, by the way, Claxton, P.P. Claxton was all. They were good friends of ours. He was superintendent of schools. One of the nicest times we ever had in our lives were the Sunday afternoons at the Claxtons. That was a wonderful experience because she would call up Sunday about 1 o'clock. What are you doing this evening? Oh, nothing in particular. Well, come on over and bring the kids at 5 o'clock and have waffles and coffee. So we'd go at 5 o'clock, and there maybe would be 10 or 12 sit around the table. They always had a big table. And we had 2 or 3 waffle irons going, and we would sit there maybe till 10 o'clock, and our 2 children would sit there with us. And I'll never forget one night especially. Dr. Claxton treated the children just as if they were adults. He talked to them just like they were adults. And that night in particular, we all got in a tremendous argument about which is more important, heredity or environment. And my son especially was, he talked about his dog, that the environment of the dog was quite important, and how it changed the dog's life by its environment. He was trying to prove that environment was more important than heredity. But Dr. Claxton would let him argue, and he was just a kid, about 10 or 12 years old.
What were the principal, as you recall, the principal happenings in Tulsa during the, I'm thinking from the standpoint of news and building, during the period from your earlier period in Tulsa?
I don't know.
What about the buildings that were built? Can you
Well,
recall?
I remember one of the main buildings that I remember was one of the National Bank buildings down there on the corner of 4th and Main. 4th and Main, wasn't there a National Bank building down there? 4th, 5th and Main, 4th and Main, or 5th and Main, 5th and Main. It was a great big building, and I know my husband rented the whole top floor of that. I never will forget that. He was connected with the Humphreys Petroleum Company, and for a long time they had that top floor of that. It was 5th and Main, I guess, and it was on the northeast corner, and it was right after the during the First World War, because right across the street from it was a big empty lot, and they had a little bit of a building there that was a Red Cross headquarters and bonds, where they sold bonds. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. Where they sold bonds. And I could watch down there. I think it was about 8 stories high. I remember when they built the Tulsa World building, too.
Remember when they built the Mayo Hotel?
Oh, my, yes. I remember when they built the Mayo Hotel. And, well, all of those big buildings, I remember when they were being built, but I don't remember just when, but I remember the building. For example, they tore down this wonderful house where I had such a little bit of a room at $5 a week. a week. I was so glad to see it torn down because I was so mad about that I didn't know what to do.
Well, that was torn down quite a long time ago, by
yes.
the time the library was built.
Yes. Oh, yes, about the public library. That's another funny thing. The first public library was in the basement of the county courthouse. And by the way, the cornerstone laying of the courthouse that has been torn down was my little girl was born on the last day of April, 1911. And when she was 3 weeks old, my husband drove me with a horse and buggy down, and I got to see the cornerstone laying of that courthouse.
Who laid it, do you remember?
I don't remember. Well, I think it was a Masonic.
Yeah.
Masonic. It was the little girl saw it too, you know. The baby saw it too, because we took her. but I hate to see that torn down. That's the only thing I've got against Tulsa.
Tearing down buildings.
We have torn down some very fine buildings that should have been kept from historical standpoints, and now they're going to tear down the other building. By the way, about the library, Alma Reed McGlenn was the first librarian we had, and she was librarian down there in the basement, and then when they had the new building, she was librarian there. And my little girl, when she was 5 years old, she had learned to read. She read before she was 4 years old, and she went down and wanted to take out a book. I always took out books in the library, and so she wanted to take out a book. And Miss McGlenn said, all right, you can just sign your name on this card. And she couldn't write. Oh, she was so mad she nearly died. So she had nothing to do, but I had to go home and teach her to write her name so she could come back and get a library card. And Miss McGlenn used to tell that all over the country when she used to have to make speeches about this 4-year-old child that went and had to learn to write her name so she'd take books out of the public library. I just love that old library, though, really. And it just makes me sick to think they're not going to use it. It ought to be a historical society, is what it should be.
Do you have any particular, in the late, in the 20s and 30s, did you or your husband have any particular civic involvement with, I know you have, with many things, but with the building of anything or with anything that might be worth mentioning?
Oh, I don't think so. You see, my husband became ill about 1933,
Mm-hmm.
and I do know that the Depression hit us pretty hard,
Mm-hmm.
and although, as I said, we got through beautifully because we didn't owe anything, but we had lots of property, and we had one house that I rent now for $150. I rented for $15 at that time, just to keep the taxes up,
Mm-hmm.
because it was just the Depression was so bad.
Can you describe some of the things that happened during the Depression that might be a reflection of the time of the Depression here?
I don't know what you mean.
Well, I'm not sure I do either.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that was quite interesting to me, just to show you how things happen. In order to help the YWCA, I wasn't on the board or anything, but I've always been fond of the YWCA. In order to help them, I took my loom down and set it up. They wanted to put in some weaving to try to get some girls interested to make some things that might be sold, some cheap things could be sold to help make themselves a living. So I took my loom down, we set it up, and while we did that, somebody brought a spinning wheel. And it was the big wheel. Now, I knew how to spin on a little wheel, but I didn't know how to spin on the big wheel, so I wanted to know how. Well, this was in the days of where people stood on the corner of 6th and Boulder, where they had kind of like the WPA, right across from the YWCA, that big brick building that they tore down there. People, you went there to get your food stamps, or they didn't have food stamps, but they had food something or other. I never did know what it was, but you had to stand in line for hours sometimes. Well, I just knew, I'd pass by there and see all those people, and I just knew there was somebody in that group that would know how to spin. So one day I went up and asked the girl, I said, if I find somebody out here that can spin, that will go with me over to the YWCA to teach me to spin, would you let me bring them in and get their food business right now ahead of everybody else so they wouldn't miss out, and yet I could take them? Oh, yes, I'd be glad to, she said. Well, I went out and stood on the steps of that place, and I hollered out real loud so they could hear me. I said, is there anybody here who can spin on the big wheel? And finally, one woman held her hand up, and I went down, and bless her heart, she had the most beautiful name on earth. Her first name was Jerusha, and her last name was Carey, Jerusha Carey. So I told her what I wanted, and she said, oh, wonderful. And so I took her, and with that, she taught me to spin. And she used to come up to my house several times a week just in order to teach me to spin on the big wheel. But I thought that was quite interesting to come out of the out of the poverty. She was.
So you've been interested in spinning ever since.
Oh yes, I spin on the little wheel all the time.
I saw some of your things back there.
Yeah.
Ms. Hannes, do you have any thoughts of any thing we ought to ask?
No, I think we've got to tell her to write a few things down
And come back.
and come back.
I think so. I'm supposed to speak at 5:30.
Uh-oh.
I'm supposed to be there at 5:30. Yes. But we'll come back later.
Well, I
Not
don't know
today,
what-
I don't mean,
no,
but
I don't know what in the world I
well,
could think
Well,
of.
You get some thought.
You just keep a piece of paper down, and if you remember anything.
Yes, I know.
this is Penwood's closing off the interview. This is March 1st, 1971.